I know you're wanting to listen to this episode of the Comics Alternative, but before we get started, let me just remind you guys that it's the gift-giving season. Now, that may be obvious, but one of the things that's not so obvious is that you can get all of your stuff and help out the podcast by going to comicsalternative.com/Amazon. Click through on our Amazon banner that you find on that page, and whatever you get during that visit to Amazon, the Comics Alternative will get a few cents kickback. So, whether it be Hanukkah, Christmas, Kwanzaa, or Festivus, get your gifts through our Amazon Associate link. It's a smart way to get your books, and you'll be helping out the podcast. And isn't that what the holiday season is all about? Helping our podcast. This is the Comics Alternative, the world's smartest comics podcast. Episode 302, a review of The Best American Comics 2018. Happy holidays, and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Sterg, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
That's right. And on this episode, our penultimate one for 2018, Sterg and I are going to look at this year's volume of The Best American Comics, guest edited by Phoebe Gloeckner and coming out from Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. But before we get to that, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the good folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts can be anywhere from 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price. Sometimes 50% off cover. But occasionally, you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that.
That's right, Derek. And if you go now, you'll find lots of 50% off bundles. You can get DC Comics, Marvel Comics, Vertigo, and also Valiant.
That's right. You know, you can find tons of comics either in bundle form or single issues, but however you get your comics, you really can't beat the prices at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com. They will take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
That's right, with bells on, because it's the season still.
That's right, yeah.
I might keep that up anyway with the bells, because I like bells on. Apparently.
Yeah. And then maybe next time we do a live recording, you could put bells on your tam.
Ding, ding, ding. Yeah, that'll be good.
Yeah, speaking of the live recording in our tams, for those who follow the show and listen to us on a regular basis, you know that last week, on the regular review show, Sterg and I did something very different. We did something for the first time. We live streamed the recording of the review show. And that was a lot of fun. And it didn't turn out to be a train wreck as we somewhat anticipated it becoming. So that was good. And we thought that we would do it again this week. We're not going to do it next week for different reasons, but we thought we'd give it another try and just see, you know, what it's like, and also to get more of our listeners and also people who may not know about this, who prowl around on YouTube, interested in the show. And also it's kind of a behind the scenes thing, right? Because as we do these live recordings, as you guys are watching this, you're seeing what goes on as we're actually recording the show. And there could be quite a number of mistakes. Like, for instance, I fumbled early on with Phoebe Gloeckner's name. And so for the show that we put up on Wednesday, I'll edit that out. But here you get to see, I guess, the two guys with PhDs talking about comics in the raw.
In the raw. I was going to say warts and all, like one of my favorite Drew Friedman books.
That's right. Yeah, it's a great one. And, you know, anytime you can reference Drew Friedman, please do so.
I will.
Yeah, I don't have my sound effects up. I would have hit some kind of celebratory sound effect. But
huzzah!
Or Oompa.
Opa!
Yeah, that's right.
Opa!
Which is rather appropriate because the text we're going, how's this for a segue? The text that we're going to discuss today is this year's volume of the Best American Comics. There you go. Sturge is holding up his copy. And the guest editor, as I mentioned, is Phoebe Gloeckner, but the series editor is Bill Kartalopoulos. Mm-hmm. And the OPA is appropriate because, as people may have heard on the episode that went up today, where Sturge and I interviewed Bill Kartalopoulos, Sturge, you have a fellow countryman.
That's right.
That we talked to. So they talked some.
A Greek guy from New York, no less. That's like a twofer for me.
Yeah. So there you go. But anyway, we had a good time doing the live streaming recording last week, and we thought we'd do it again. And this time around, talking about Best American Comics 2018.
That's right. From Hart and Mifflin Hardcore. Mm-hmm. Right there.
I just want your love for Christmas. I can't wait until it's spring. Everything I want for Christmas, you and you alone can bring. I'm very fond of Christmas carols.
Okay, let's go ahead and begin discussing the contents and our takes on this year's Best American Comics volume. Now, for those who've been listening to the podcast for several years, you may already know this, but for newer or first-time listeners, or in this case, watchers on YouTube, viewers, one of the things we try to do every year is to use our penultimate episode to discuss the current year's Best American Comics. Now, this originally came out back in very early October. So Best American Comics 2018 has been out for over 2 months now. Nonetheless, since we're at the end of the year and a lot of people in the media, not only podcasts, but television, radio, and what have you, reviewers on blogs and whatnot, magazines, do bests of episodes or best of articles. So this is kind of in the spirit of that. Now, next week, which will be our last episode for 2018, Sturge and I are going to share what each of us considers our favorite 10 comics, graphic novels, whatever you want to call them, of the past year. But on this penultimate show for 2018, we wanted to discuss what apparently both Bill Kartalopoulos and Phoebe Gloeckner consider the best American comics, not from 2018. Actually, these are comics in this volume that were released between September 1st, 2016 and August 31st of 2017. And they do that for logistical reasons. I mean, obviously, Best American Comics 2018 can't include comics from 2018. But they need that lead time from, let's say, the tail end of August from the previous year up into the pub date in fall of the current year, this year, 2018, in order to pull everything together, get it to the printer, and put out the book in time. Yeah, but I appreciate this is there's a lot in here that was new to me. So yeah, and maybe that's a pretty good place to start. One of the things that we didn't do in our interview with Bill Kartalopoulos that came out when this goes up as a podcast earlier this week is we didn't really talk about the contributions or the content of this year's volume of Best American Comics. We were much more concerned about the process of pulling everything together. And Bill, as series editor, was the one to talk to about that. So he gave us some insights, some behind the scene information. And if you haven't listened to that interview with Bill Kartalopoulos about this year's volume, then definitely go back and listen to it. It's worth it because it kind of demystifies to some degree, I think, the process of pulling together this volume.
Yeah, and I really appreciated learning about that. I mean, to me, personally, we're going to talk next week about our favorites, and that's, arbitrary to some sense. It's like the things that I get, the things that fall into my lap, the things that sometimes show up for our podcast. Sometimes it's things that I get from a publisher I don't even know existed. So it's kind of, I read a lot, so I'm not going to say it's representative in any way. So, getting some clarity about what the process is for selection is definitely helpful, I think. And, and there's other comics too. We talked a little bit off air. There's nothing Marvel and DC in this book. And that's very much like the when people think of comics, they generally think of superhero things. And this is, a different flavor of comics too. And, representative of a different kind of set of publishers or set of creators even.
Exactly. Now, I want to come back to something that you said a moment ago, and that was that a lot of the things, maybe even most of the entries in this year's Best American Comics volume are things you didn't know about before. And, that's something that I've always enjoyed and appreciated about every year's volume of Best American Comics. I look at it two ways. One, in going through the year's Best American Comics volume, with the material that I already knew, especially the stuff that we discussed on previous podcast episodes, what that does is, in some way, not that we necessarily need this, but it kind of validates our reading choices and what we decide to discuss on episodes of the podcast. And so it makes me feel good. It's kind of like, patting myself on the back. So yeah, well, other people think that this is one of the bests of that time period as well. But another thing, in a less vain aspect, an appreciation I get from each volume of Best American Comics is that it's an incredible entry point into a whole array of comics that I didn't know about. And I think the vast majority of these are self-published or very limited run that, I wouldn't know how to get, even if I knew how to reach out to the artists. I mean, maybe through their websites. But even then, if I don't know who these creators are, how would I know about their websites? So this is a good way of introducing yourself to a lot of alternative, indie, self-published comics.
Yeah, and mini comics. There's a few mini comics in here too. And those are, very, very limited in print run and access to them. I mean, you basically have to run into the person at a show and get it from them, or if you know who they are, kind of mail away for it. But otherwise, I love mini comics, but I think that building a comprehensive collection of them would be kind of a impossible task, because there's no possible way to get all of them just because they're all over the place.
Yeah, exactly. And, maybe you could come across some of these mini comics through, let's say, John Porcelino's Spit and a Half side. But even then, I mean, he doesn't have everything under the sun when it comes to mini comics. I mean, he has a lot. So, I mean, this, I think, is one good way, along with, John's Spit and a Half website, of finding self-published mini comics, things that you didn't know exist. And that's one of the things I look forward to every year with the Best American Comics.
Yeah. And I appreciate the gamut. There's a whole lot of things in here.
Exactly. Now, I went through and I counted right before we got online. There are 33 entries in this year's volume of Best American Comics. And of the 33, because I felt like I knew over half of them or had read over half of them. But when I counted, not quite half. There were 13 of these entries in this anthology that I had read previously and I already knew about. Maybe I forgot something about the storyline or what happens in the excerpt, but I knew not quite half of them. Did you know a lot of these already?
I knew a lot of the creators, but out of the things that I'd actually read, I think my number is very small, something like 6. I think 6 of the things I had read, but a lot of the creators' names I know, and I've seen their work in other, like Now anthology that we read and talk about from Fantagraphics. A lot of the creators are in that. Some of them are on the web a lot, and I follow them around, or they've done prior books. Like Sarah Glidden, I hadn't read Rolling Blackouts, but I had read the Learn Everything About Israel in 60 days. Yeah, I'd read that and I really enjoyed that. And it's just, there's a lot in here that I appreciate, actually, the excerpts in a sense, just because like I've been talking about, sometimes I just run out of time and I mean to read a book, but I haven't. So this is kind of like a kick in the butt. That's like, you know what? Those are a good 10 pages. You need to find the rest of that book and delve into the rest. Because, that's a book I was looking forward to and wanted to read. And I know it's been very celebrated. So now, there's a little fire under me to pick that up and, get off my tuchus and read it.
Yeah. Tuchus. There's a good word. Good Yiddish word. You mentioned something about the excerpts and you were appreciating the excerpts. I come from a different perspective in that I'm not that thrilled with excerpts. I know that you're going to find those in anthologies such as this, and there's no way around it. I'm just not particularly drawn to them, and it's more of a matter of taste than critical appreciation, let's say. So I have nothing against excerpts. It's just I would rather read entire works instead of excerpts. And one example of, let's say, an issue that comes up with me personally when it comes to excerpt is, and I knew it was going to be here, right? And that is Emil Ferris's My Favorite Thing is Monsters, Book 1, which was one of my favorites from 2017. And when it comes right down to it, it was like my favorite, absolutely number one of last year. But the excerpt we get in My Favorite Things is in this year's volume of Best American Comics from My Favorite Thing is Monsters just seemed, I don't know, to me a little unrepresentative. And I'll tell you why, because it deals with, I guess, well, it's Anka's story. And Anka, I guess she's a kind of a major minor character. In other words, she's definitely not the protagonist. The young girl who sees herself as a monster, who absolutely loves monsters, who becomes a detective. And she becomes fascinated by Anka's story. And Anka's story is important in My Favorite Thing is Monsters, Book 1. However, I think it would have been a little more, I guess, appropriate to give a taste of what that book is about, to include a segment with the narrator herself in her monster self, and some of her predispositions, her thoughts, her detective-like ways. Maybe it was just easier to excerpt a part of Anka's story as opposed to the protagonists, but I don't know. I just thought that was a little less representative than it could have been. But again, that's maybe more personal taste than anything.
Yeah, and I hear what you're saying. I mean, I think logistically, the things that Bill has to deal with too, probably page count and how much of a thing can you do there and how much of a chunk from that book can you present and have it be, representative of how excellent it is. Because I agree with you that this is one of those, it's like a slam dunk to me. Like I read that book and I was dumbfounded. I was like, this is like an amazing achievement of a book. And, it's like a hurricane in comics or something like that. Although hurricanes aren't really amazing. It's a force of nature. I don't know. Emil Ferris is like a force of nature. That's what I mean to say in that. And, I fully expected that to be here, but maybe, finding that one part that, there's so much in that book that I think it has so many multiple payoffs that, like without the context of some of that, you might not get just quite how, like the context that would make the comic, sell the comics or how good they are, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So, but I agree with you. I mean, it is problematic, just to kind of find a chunk that's self-contained that, shows just how great it is. But I don't know, if somebody for some reason didn't know that book existed, I think this would be maybe something that they could see and be like, oh, okay, there's a hook. And then when they read it, they'd be like, oh my God, the book isn't about this at all. Well, like you said, it's not the main thrust of the book. This is it's a component, but it's not, it's like, it's a part of the main narrative, but it's not the main narrative. Yeah.
And you talked about slam dunks. I mean, there are several creators and definitely works from that time period, right? September of 2016 up to the end of August of last year that just seemed to be slam dunks like, of course it's going to be there.
Right.
I think to some degree, Geof Darrow with the Shaolin Cowboy Who Will Stop the Rain, that kind of surprised me a little bit, but given Darrow's art, which I think is just incredible.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that in and of itself is a reason for this to be in this year's volume. Jaime Hernandez, any year where Hernandez is not included in the Best American Comics, something's wrong. This is a great excerpt from Love and Rockets, or at least Jaime's contribution, Forest Spirits. Another one that really made sense to me was Keiler Roberts, an excerpt from Sunburning. Now, something like Sunburning, I think, and there are other examples of these, are relatively easy and definitely appropriate in terms of excerpting because they're short pieces, a collection of short pieces. So it's easier to get a sense of what a particular text is about. So I really like that. Another one that made sense to me but I'm kind of surprised in a way that it's here, but in a good way, and that is Jesse Jacobs' Crawl Space.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that one up. That was one of the ones I was thinking about too, because he's one of those people that, you know, as a person in, you know, who reads comics, but he's one of those people that people who make comics are kind of like, I need to read everything that guy does. So it's like whatever he's doing is inherently interesting. And I mean, just because he's such a creative person and his use of color, like looking through this, you know, I've read multiple of his books. I have not read Crawl Space. But I really want to. And I, you know, it's like a feast. It's like a visual feast, and it's a longer excerpt too. This is like it's almost 20 pages, I think. So it lasts for quite a while, and I really, really appreciated that being in here. You know, I think to kind of go back to something else you said. I mean, if there's not a piece by a Hernandez brother in like a best of, that probably just means that they didn't put out a comic that year for some reason. But because I agree,
which is highly unlikely.
Yeah, exactly. Especially with Gilbert's output. I mean, but you know, and the book, one book I kind of was glad to see excerpted, just because I really liked it, and I love this creator's comics, but I think it's kind of fallen by the wayside. I don't hear about it so much. Is the Joel Ollman's The Abominable Mr. Seabrook, which I loved that book. It was one of my favorites of, was it 2016 when it came out?
2017, I believe.
2017?
The very beginning of 2017, yes.
Okay, so that was like...
Or maybe it was 26. I think 27. Okay, I think it was... Maybe it was 2016. I think you're right. Maybe. I don't know. I'm forgetting now. But I know it was one of my favorites of the year that it came out. And we had Joe on the show to talk about it.
Yeah, and I remember him being interviewed about it, and I listened to that one, and I listened to a lot of the interviews, even when I'm not involved or wasn't involved. And I really love this book. I mean, it was meticulously researched. It's about a figure who's, I think, pivotal and important in a way, and also forgotten. So, you know, just the work and the labor that went into that volume, let alone, you know, him telling a story, and, you know, not just it being a history of a person, but also kind of like we joked about this podcast being the live ones being a slow motion train wreck. His life was a slow motion train wreck. Seabrook. It's just like, you know, you see a person just get consumed by his lifestyle and alcoholism. And, you know, it's heartbreaking and horrible, but fascinating at the same time, just because he was such a way out character who lived this larger than life, you know, style, or, you know, went places and sought out, you know, experiences in the world. And, you know, to have all that captured in this book was remarkable. So I'm really glad to see that in here, because that's some excellent comics that I think have, you know, not gotten the attention that they're due.
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned that. Actually, that's one of my kind of no-brainers. It definitely should have been in here. And I've been a big fan of Joe's work for quite a number of years.
Oh, yeah.
This is very different from the kind of stuff that he would write about, which was either fictional or autobiographical. And I remember doing not a podcast interview, but I did a text-based interview with him for the Comics Alternative blog a few years ago. And at the time, he was in the midst of working on the Seabrook book, and I'd never heard of Seabrook before he had told me about him. So I looked him up after he brought him up. So I knew this was in the works. And then, of course, when The Abominable Mr. Seabrook came out, then Kunka and I had him on the show. Great guy, does incredible work, and I think that the year that it came out, The Abominable Mr. Seabrook was one of the best of the year.
Yeah, I agree.
Mini Huni Santa with a big old pool, bringing Christmas presents in his red canoe. Mini Huni Santa under the coconut tree, weaving hats for Keiki and for you and me. I know you only work at night, building Christmas toys, with many little people helping bring.
And there's, I mean, just some other people in here. I mean, Gabrielle Bell. She's
that's another one. Yep, of course, Gabrielle Bell.
Yeah, and you know, she's another one of those ones that, like, you know, every time I see lists of people that, you know, comics artists, especially, like, who do you follow? They're all like, Gabrielle Bell is like phenomenal, and you should totally read everything she read or writes or puts out.
Yeah, and this is an excerpt from something that came out, I believe it was last year, and that is Everything is Flammable. And the thing that's interesting about Everything is Flammable, or I guess Gabrielle Bell's work as a whole, is that it's very similar to what we see, let's say, with Keiler Roberts, because many of them are short strips of just a few pages that can more easily be excerpted, let's say, than longer works such as more novelistic in nature, like My Favorite Thing is Monsters, as I used as an example a little while ago. Although the interesting thing about Everything is Flammable, and I think we may have brought this up with Gabrielle when we had her on the show, but I can't recall exactly. But this was marketed as her first memoir. And I didn't see it any different from her other collections like Cecil and Jordan in New York or Voyeurs, because you take all the short bits together and they do tell a story in a memoir-ish way or a life story way. Maybe Everything is Flammable in terms of some of its stories, her relationship with her mother, if you remember, getting a new house because something happened to the other one. It is a longer narrative, and it may be more of a sustained story that you would find in a memoir, but I still saw it as, in essence, no different from her earlier collections.
Oh, and I've just read Cecil and Jordan in New York because Uncivilized Press released a new edition of it this year. They included a new story, I think, and that one's full of autobiographical and fictional things, so it kind of jumps around, where I think Everything is Flammable is only her autobiographical stuff. And I agree. I remember it being marketed as her first graphic novel too, but it's definitely episodic. But I think it's more solely devoted to her autobiography. And a lot of them are, like you said, are her going to work with her mom and help her establish herself in her new house, and kind of, the trials and travails and things that go through with that. Because, she's kind of a difficult personality to deal with, or likes being isolated. So, I think like you said, it's more episodic and it's more autobiographical. It's just kind of it's more extended, I guess, of it. It's like there's no fiction in there at all.
Yeah. It's interesting that you were making a distinction between autobiography and fiction in terms of Gabrielle Bell. I think of it as about all autobiography with, at times, a fantastical or fictional twist to it. Because one of the things, and I think that the introduction, I don't know if it's Phoebe Gloeckner's or I am assuming it's Gabrielle Bell's, at the very beginning of her selection, is that the thing about her comics is that they're autobiographical, but sometimes they take flights of fancy. So things happen in these quote unquote memoirist strips that is fictional. But like, for instance, I think it's one of the entries that we get here, isn't it? Where she takes some kind of medicine or supplement that improves her memory, and then she realizes that she's actually another person, that she forgot that she was this person, and then she has a whole other life, and then she quits taking the supplement and she forgets about who she really was. And again, that didn't happen, but that's the thing I love about Gabrielle Bell's comics, is that they are primarily memoirist or autobiographical in nature in some form or another, but they take really wild sidelines many times that are fantastic and completely unrealistic. And it's fun. I mean, I think of her as a fun cartoonist.
Yeah. And it kind of treads the line for me. She's kind of in the same vein as like somebody like Noah Van Sciver, where it's like a lot of the stuff that they write about is difficult. And if it was happening to me, it would be a burden and it would be stressful and it would lead me to have lots of anxiety. But when I see other people doing it and working through it, and with their voice, there's definitely a tinge of dark humor to it. Like, it is funny, even though it's not funny in a lot of ways. I mean, the story in this is horrible. It's about, cats being killed by dogs, basically. And, not a funny story, but, there's something, it's not like a Tom and Jerry cartoon, but it is like a Tom and Jerry cartoon, just horrible and realistic and strange, but also evocative and realistic.
Yeah. And maybe what we're doing now is an appropriate way to discuss the various entries in this year's volume of the Best American Comics. And that is maybe just to skip around and to highlight kind of in free form manner, what we consider some of the standout pieces. Because one of the things, I don't know, anytime we discuss an anthology of some sort on the podcast, I always try to resist the urge to fall back on, it's kind of easy, which ones are your favorites and which ones are my favorites. And let's talk about those. I do have favorites, and some of these comics in this year's volume resonate to me more than others. But if they don't resonate with me as much, it's primarily a matter of taste. And I have no problem in bringing up issues of taste on the show. At the same time, I think that it's incumbent on us as comics critics and scholars to look at some of these stories a little more objectively, to kind of pull back and look beyond or maybe even underneath our own personal likes and dislikes and just see, what makes this a particularly successful comic or something that's different, or what is a creator doing that is outstanding in an unusual way, or maybe a not so unusual way, let's say. For instance, with the art of Darrow, it's just fabulous art. It's just incredibly detailed and eye-catching. But there are a lot of artists who do incredible visuals that are eye-catching. So in that sense, it may not be unique, but it is, Geof Darrow's style, and it's phenomenal.
Yeah, and there were several things that jumped out at me in the book that there were things I didn't know about, or things I knew about but hadn't seen a lot of. Like, for instance, one of the ones that kind of stood out to me is by Julian Glander. And it was originally published at Vice.com. And I think if I'm remembering this right, it's on page 112 of the book. It's a selection from Susan something. And if I remember right, I think Julian Glander was in a recent issue of Now.
I think so, yeah.
Does all the 3D stuff. And I hadn't really been familiar with that, but these excerpts for me, they stand out because the artwork is, kind of like 3D renderings, and they look kind of like Gumby type, art cloaky. Here, I can show you. Look, there's Susan right there. It looks like, I don't know, they were just interesting. Like, the first one was just funny to me. Like, it was just,
with the digital pet or the mega pet.
Yeah, it's like, I remember, when I taught middle school, my kid, the students were all into Tamagotchis. And this is kind of like a person 20 years later or 17 years later hasn't logged into this account and finds it, and the pet's still there. Is very hungry at this point. And it's just like, it's like, well, I figured out you weren't coming back, and I went and got a degree and made a life for myself, and I got a family. We're very happy. And, go away, basically, which is a strange, interesting thing. And, I, like you said, it might be a matter of taste. It just, something about this art style and the storytelling and it being surreal in some ways and realistic in other ways is just, I don't know. I thought that to me was like a standout as like an exceptional entry in this, like you said, just something that just, they grabbed me, and I thought it worked. And there are multiple episodes of it, because I think they're published originally online, and they're like, like three pages each or something like that. So we get like 2 or 3, little episodes from Susan's life.
Yeah. Something that I didn't know about before, both in terms of the comic itself and the creator, I didn't know who this person was, that really stood out to me. And this is it begins on page 196. And this is Julia Jacquette's Playground of My Mind. It's an excerpt from a piece that was originally published in a larger work called Playground of My Mind, which was published by the Welland Museum of Art and Delmonico Books. And I want to point out something that kind of surprises me that I like this so much in a moment, but I really did enjoy this. I've never seen, Jacquette, and I guess that's how you pronounce her last name, Jacquette. I've never seen her work before. And basically what this is it's an excerpt from a longer work that's apparently about 62 pages. And it's about a young girl who is recalling growing up in New York, in Manhattan, during the 1960s and then I guess into the 1970s, and primarily as it applies to her living space, specifically playgrounds, and what they meant to her. At least that's what the excerpt seems to be mostly about. And so I really did appreciate this, especially the way in which that Jacquette not just deals with the subject matter, but many times with the text, literally bends it around her images in a way that, to me at least, underscored the kind of meandering, kind of winding nature of memory, where it doesn't necessarily move in a straight line. It goes one place, then another. It kind of moves around and, if you will, bend back on itself in many ways. And so the way that the text was arranged along with the images really stood out to me. And the art, I think, was really good. So I think of all of the things I didn't know about before, and I'm not counting someone like, let's say, a selection from Art School by Matthew Thurber, which is toward the back of the book. I hadn't read that before, but I'm familiar with Thurber's work, so I knew who he was. But this is an example of a creator and a work that I didn't even know about before. So this is the one that really stands out for me. Now, I said a second ago that it kind of surprises me that I liked this so much. That's because this comic is an example of something that, again, when it comes to matters of taste, usually doesn't stick out for me. And I think the same can be said for the one that follows this. And this is Andrei Kurevsky and Ed Kurevsky's Miss V, My Last Love Story, which was interesting. But the reason why these kind of comics usually don't resonate with me personally is I'm not the biggest fan of not necessarily text-heavy comics, but comics that are a series of images, and the vast majority, if not the entire text basis of what we see, is outside of any visuals. In other words, and I think that it's something that I remember when I first read Bechdel's Fun Home, I had a similar experience because it was narration heavy. Right. And so you didn't get near as much, so to speak, action within the panels themselves. I mean, you got some. And I think that both Miss V, My Last Love, and then Playground of My Mind are examples of those kind of comics that normally I wouldn't be drawn to. But I have to say that Julia Jacquette's excerpt from Playground of My Mind was one of the standouts for me.
I agree. That was one of the ones when I read it, there was a part of me in the back of my head that thought, this is just a scrapbook, in a way. Yeah. And the more I thought about it, though, something like Sean Tan's book, The Arrival, is also kind of like a visual scrapbook. It doesn't have any words in it. And, but that's more like a narrative based. And I thought Playground of My Mind, especially, what I appreciated about it is kind of how she bent the text around the images. And the thought, I think, that went into that, and the way that the way she used negative space around things, definitely this is it's a piece of autobiography, but it's also kind of a meditation on architecture. So I think it works like that because it's kind of like, to me, it uses a lot of the affordances of comics to kind of make a visual essay. And I thought of it more like that than I did like a straight narrative. And and like the artwork, like you said, is impressive. It's gorgeous. I like how things are arranged. I like how the pages flow. I like how the considerations of architecture and some of the more technical or historical stuff worked in here. I don't know. I think it's difficult to make something information rich and also aesthetically pleasing and also kind of gripping narratively speaking. And I think she did all three of those things with this, and I'm definitely interested in checking out the whole rest of the thing. I would like to see the rest of this. And I had, like you said, I had not been familiar with her or this work. So I think it's fascinating. As for Ms. V, I really liked, I had the same kind of issue that you did. That one is much more text heavy and, it's more like an illustrated story.
Right.
In a lot of ways. And
like an adult picture book.
Yeah, like an adult picture book. Yeah, definitely adult and
definitely adult, because there is quite a bit of risque narrative going on.
There is. It involves adults and it involves adult situations.
That's right.
And I don't know. It's it's another piece of autobiography. It kind of reminded me a lot of. This is not comics, but here in Knoxville, there's an artist that does kind of large prints that are all about like figures in country music. So it'll be like a picture of Johnny Cash in the middle, and I'll have like text here and text here and text here and text here. And you don't really need, the Johnny Cash picture. And it's almost in the same style of like artistically as, this is very, what's the word I would use? It's like purposely raw, I would say. This is not polished in the sense that, if a person that was not into comics read this, they might look at it and go like, oh, a kid drew this, because it's very, basically representation. Like I'm saying things, I'm trying not to show adult bits so that Twitter gets mad at us, but you can see what it looks like, like that. Mm-hmm. And I'm not downplaying the art or the art style or saying that, it's childish, but if you weren't, familiar with art styles, you might think, kids could draw that, which I think is kind of the point of this, is that it's, it's more rougher and not polished and more like raw, I guess, because of the kind of experiences. And like you say at the end, it's almost like scratchboard art towards the end, some of those bits where it gets particularly adult or negative, where it's, predominantly black backgrounds with white line work. And, there's still a lot of text until the very, very end. So I liked it, and I was not familiar with it, and it's different. And I think that's one of the things I think, a volume like this has got to be hard in a lot of sense to kind of get, the kind of gamut of artistic styles and things that are possible with comics. So I appreciate it being there. Would it be I actually like the story, especially the
story. Yeah.
The execution is, it might be a bit text heavy for me too, just because, like you said, it's more like an adult picture book thing, but comics is, I don't know, it's a hard thing to pin down.
Exactly. And again, one of the benefits, this is something we talked with Bill about the other day, is that many of the entries in not only this year's volume, but in previous volumes of Best American Comics kind of challenge our understanding of comics. And that's something that I appreciate. Again, it may not be to my taste. It may not resonate with me in ways that other comics do, but it nonetheless brings to the fore this question, what is a comic and how would you define this? So I think that it's good that these comics are in there for that. Something else you said about the Miss V comic is that the art style seemed to be, as you put it, something like a kid could do. And we hear this every now and again, right?
Right.
That if the art isn't slick, if the visuals aren't as polished as, let's say, what we find more in the mainstream. And by mainstream, in this episode especially, I'm referring to that kind of broadly. I'm talking about premier comics publishers like Image and Dark Horse and IDW and Boom and Dynamite, not necessarily just DC and Marvel. Right. But if the art style isn't of that quality and polish, then you're more apt to hear, oh, my kid could do something like that. And there are a couple of other examples in the book of this, or actually more than a couple, but two that stand out to me is Abraham Diaz's Brosbad, and then Michael Ridge's excerpt from Food Friends, that number 12, that's untitled. I mean, this is art that I can imagine a reader of comics, let's say more traditional mainstream comics, picking up this volume of Best American Comics and saying, this is a comic? You really do think that this is a serious comic, and you're including this in a book with the title Best American Comics of 2018, and making fun of the art style and saying something to the effect of, this is something like a kid would do, or this is something that my nephew or niece would illustrate. And so they're just not used to this. And I think that those who may have that kind of reaction, and I'm not delegitimizing that reaction, right? Because a lot of what we read, and not just in terms of comics or what we consume, has a lot to do with taste, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I could see why people may think that. At the same time, I would ask those readers to momentarily let's say, abandon their preconceived notion of comics and just see what other creators do under the title or medium title of comics to kind of challenge their understanding of how they define a comic.
The icicle man had a frozen nose.
Ooh, it's cold. It's cold.
He had ice all over his clothes.
Ooh, it's cold. It's cold.
He was frozen half to death.
Ooh, it's cold. It's cold.
And he couldn't get his breath. Oh, the icicle man.
And I agree with what you're talking about too. I don't know. There was a lot in here that made me uncomfortable too, and I think kind of willfully so. Not just in terms of the art styles, but one of the ones I really enjoyed, and I'm going to use "enjoyed" in quotes. I can do that here, air quotes. Enjoyed, because it wasn't. But Margot by Margot Ferrick, which looks sort of like that.
Oh yeah,
which is a horrible story in a way, because it's basically like a remembrance of an abortion is what
right.
It is. And kind of sorting through the feelings associated with it, and it being kind of like a hello and a goodbye in a way to just, a person that didn't become a person in
right.
a way. And to me, that was one of the ones that it's a lot of it's representational and not, it's a weird mixture of words and pictures.
Mm-hmm.
And I say weird, not like, I don't know, it's unusual. I mean, but I can't imagine going through the experience and the emotions and trying to sort through that kind of thing and deal with the multiplicity of what's happening in a life and trying to represent it, I think is it's remarkable to me that, even attempting to do it. And to me, this is just like very brave comics making, and kind of groundbreaking in the sense of, trying to represent, how do you represent something like that? How do you convey that to somebody who may or may not have the same experience as you? Or how do you just get it out of your system and put it out there in the world in a way that, you feel, I'm not going to say like closure or something like that, but, you feel satisfied with the result. And to me, that was one of the books or one of the comics in here that was, I don't know, it did thing, it wrestles with that thing. What is comics? What can comics do? What can you put in comics? You're not going to find this in like an IDW book or a Boom book.
Right.
But I'm
maybe a
glad
Fantagraphics or running quarterly, but
right. And I really appreciated getting that in here. It's described as the last comic in a collection of love letter comics. And it's like, wow, what kind of, this is like a remarkable and, version of a love letter, honestly. And I really, that was one of the ones that's jumped out at me just because, it was like, wow, to me, like a wow, like the whole experience of reading it and thinking about the conception of it and, trying to work through things in this format, it's remarkable to me.
Yeah, it was a very impactful story. And it's one of the two pieces in this year's volume that you have to turn the book in order to read just because of the layout. The other one that you have to turn in order to read, at least read appropriately, is the entry by Casanova Frankenstein. And I like Casanova Frankenstein's work. I've communicated with him quite a bit in the past, not only via email, but also through various social media outlets like Instagram. And he's an interesting fellow, let's just say. I don't know if you've read many of his comics, but his excerpt is from Purgatory. And this excerpt is titled A Taste of Purgatory. So I like his work. I think maybe I'm wrong, but I vaguely remember him being in an earlier volume of Best American Comics. Maybe I'm misremembering, but at least in this year's volume, it's good to see him in here. Yeah,
and I agree. And they look kind of like this, we have, Aris Kotsis is out there, and he said he likes seeing the images. So I'm showing. That's why I'm showing the images.
Aris, welcome back to the show. We're glad that you're back for the second week in a row watching us live stream a recording of this week's show, the regular review show.
So you ask and you shall receive. But yeah, I love this story too. I had not been familiar with Casanova Frankenstein at all, other than I think that's a villain for Flaming Carrot comics. I think that's what the name, or the Mystery Men. I think the Mystery Men fight Casanova Frankenstein, which is it's a great name.
Yeah.
But yeah, I loved, there was a lot in here for me to think about, because it was basically, like a remembrance of being a young person into something that other people were not into, and they kind of made you feel crappy about yourself because you were into comics or into whatever you were. And, I do like the horizontal format too. I like that things play around. That is definitely a nice feature of the book.
I'm glad you brought up Margot Ferrick's Margot, because I think that, along with Jacquette's excerpt of Playground of My Mind, are the two big standouts in terms of this either self-published or limited run, hard to find comics that I probably wouldn't known about otherwise, that I really liked. I can't say the same of the others that are brand new to me in terms of the creators. I may have liked it well enough, but again, more on a critical appreciative side. But personally, they just didn't have the same resonance as, the one by Jacquette and that piece, Margot, that you brought up. And maybe I'm being a little unfair here, but I'm kind of, as I was reading this year's volume, I kept thinking about my experience of reading the 2017 volume of Best American Comics, which was guest edited by Ben Katcher. And let me preface this by saying that I am a gigantic Ben Katcher fan. And he's been on the show, or I've interviewed him at least 3 times, I think twice for the podcast, and then once in a text interview, maybe twice in a text interview, I believe. So I love his work. So I'm more predisposed to his aesthetic choices. Last year's volume, hands down, in terms of the Best American Comics series, is by far my favorite. I think Ben's sense of humor, and also his definition of comics being as expansive as it is, contributed to, at least for me, the success and my enjoyment of that volume. And there were so many pieces in the 2017 volume of Best American Comics that I didn't even know existed before. And even things that if I didn't see it within the covers of Best American Comics, I would be hard pressed to think of as a comic. Even now, some of the things that he included, I don't know if I personally would define it as a comic, but I'm glad that he included the pieces in there because, again, this kind of expansion of our definition and comfort zone of what a comic is. So I was bowled away by Katcher's guest edited volume from last year. And so then I come to this year's volume. And as I mentioned, it's not quite half of the entries I already knew. So already there's little surprise in here for me. I mean, I enjoyed it, and I think that this is a successful volume of Best American Comics, but I knew most of it already. I'm not exactly sure what that says. But one of the things that I got, or maybe didn't get, out of this year's volume is not as much exposure to a wider variety of these unknown creators like I had in terms of my experience reading last year's volume. And as I said, maybe it's unfair for me to compare Phoebe Gloeckner's efforts to Ben Katcher's, but I couldn't help but continue to think about last year's volume and my experience reading that.
And I think that kind of speaks to also the kind of the editor and the editor's kind of sensibilities. And, a lot of this is, it's subjective. And I mean, one of the things I thought about a lot, especially given what I know about Gloeckner's work and, what she talks about in the autobiography, and not autobiography, in her introduction, her place of coming from is, she has a pretty impressive background with the underground comics of the 60s and 70s. A lot of those creators. And that this book kind of felt like visceral to me in a way, like a lot of those comics do, and I think maybe, like you said, they're different in the terms of, who's represented or what's the style. And, maybe Katcher just resonates with you in a way that she doesn't, or her sensibility or his sensibility. I don't know. I mean, but I think of things like, like this to me, like there was a lot in this book that made me feel like like I would say are visceral comics that kind of grab you and make you be like uncomfortable with a lot of things. I don't know. That's the way I felt. Like I appreciated a lot of them. I won't say I liked them, because it wasn't like, oh, I read it and it's a lot of fun. But I think a lot of them were moving in ways that were kind of, horrible and visceral.
I like the way you put that, because as you were describing your experience in reading this, the visceral aspect of most of these entries, I was thinking that it's a very different approach than, let's say, Catcher's aesthetics, if we want to call it that.
Mm-hmm.
And his are more, I don't want to say more intellectual, more heady. In other words, they're more critical and theoretical, I think, in terms of what he poses as defining comics or what creators do, and how comics can participate along with other media in ways that they still retain their comicness, but at the same time, they're kind of something different. In other words, he kind of challenges us in a variety of different ways that I think are much more aesthetic, theoretical than what we see in terms of this year's volume. And in many ways, Ben reminds me, and I guess his guest editorship of last year's volume reminds me more of what Scott McCloud does, and let's keep in mind, McCloud was one of the guest editors he was the guest editor back in 2014. And McCloud, by his own admission, is a more theoretical, almost intellectual creator when it comes to comics and his appreciation of comics. And I see Ben Catcher being more in line with the Scott McCloud school than definitely the Phoebe Gloeckner school of, the kind of comics that really do take off for them.
Yeah. And for me, this is like an interesting part because I think about comics and what they can do. And I think this is maybe a more traditional volume, like in terms of technically speaking, like the comics themselves are not so much like the, pushing the envelope so much as the stories that they're containing are trying to. And I'm thinking like, I love Guy Delisle. He's on page 55. He's got an excerpt from his book Hostage. And, it's about a person, I'll put more the picture here. It's basically a person being held hostage by a terrorist organization. Right. And, it's at least this part is like it's very gritty. It's like basically a guy chained to a bed and, the things he's trying to do to kind of get by and make his life tolerable and, in an intolerable situation or something like later in the book. One of the ones that jumped out at me is called Ugly by Chloë Perkins.
Yes.
And that one is, I'm going to find something that I can show you without YouTube getting mad. Because there's a lot of naked stuff in that one too, but this is like her
naked.
This person of undeterminate gender, looking in a mirror and just dealing with perceptions of beauty, and it goes on for a while. And it's that's one of the ones that just jumped out at me too, just because you couldn't not pay attention to that comic. It was just like it just reached out and grabbed you, and it's visceral. There's like. It looks like blood sometimes. There's like lipstick. There's all kinds of bodily mutilation and stuff happening in it.
It's almost like I got the sense of this as almost like a performance piece.
Yeah.
In comics form.
That's a good way to put it, I think. And yeah, that one to me just it demanded attention. And but the comics themselves are not part of it, but the imagery. The comics are not like, it's panels. It's what you would look at as like, left to right, top to bottom comics. But, the stuff that's being explored, or, it's like variations on, beauty and ugliness and trying to reconcile the two in really powerful formats. Or even things like a few pages later on 310, there's a comic called Untitled by Michael Ridge. That was originally published in something called Food Friends, but PHOOD PHRENDS #2, and it looks like an Archie comic.
The characters, definitely look like Archie.
But
I have no freaking idea what is coming out of their eyes and mouth.
Yeah, it's like this black liquid is just constantly streaming out of their orifices as they sit and talk in the car, and may or may not neck when they get to Lookout Point.
Yeah, even though she's much too young for him.
It's an issue.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, I want to bring up another point about this year's volume, and not just this year's volume, because I seem to remember this being the case with previous volumes. I can't remember exactly which ones. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking about this. You were mentioning Perkis's Ugly, and I was looking at the very first page, and the way that I think most volumes are arranged, if you can see this, each entry has a little information about the creator and the piece. So there's a very brief or sometimes a little longer biography, and then a statement from the creator that I guess the guest editor solicits. Now, if you look at the one in Ugly, the biography of Chloë Perkis is in the third person. So it's as if someone else wrote it. Mm-hmm. I think that Perkis wrote it, and I'll tell you why. Because many of these entries, including the next one, and this is on page 300, by Richie Pope. And whoops, I just hit my microphone. And I'll hold this up. This is the bio. And by the way, this comes from issue number 13 of Frontier, and I think we discussed this. We reviewed this issue when it originally came out. Frontier, by the way, from Youth in Decline, a fabulous series, and I strongly recommend that people check it out if they don't know about it. But Richie Pope, under the biography, he says, I'm an illustrator cartoonist originally from Newport News, Virginia. Mm-hmm. Now, some of these bios that begin each of the 33 entries, I think most are written in the third person, some in the first person. And the statements, more times than not, include a first person reference, or this is what I was thinking, or my comic is about, or this is something going through my head. Mm-hmm. Now, I have no problem with the first person in the statements.
Right.
But and maybe this is the editor in me coming out. What I would have opted for is consistency with the biographies. So if most of the biographies, even if written by the creators themselves, are written in the third person, they write about themselves in a kind of a detached way. They don't refer to themselves in the first person. Then make all of them like that. And in terms of the bios, not the comments or the statements, but the brief biographies, if most of them are third person, make all of them third person. And that's an editorial choice. If they want to be in the first person, then make all of them in the first person. I don't know. That maybe it's just a little small something, but I would have appreciated more consistency in terms of editing the biographies. But again, that's a minor, almost nitpick, I think.
Yeah, and then just leafing through, I mean, they're all over, not all over the place. Most of the time, the biography seems to be more third person. The statements are half first person, and sometimes they just say, what the piece is. Like, there's no mention of even a person. It's just kind of like, this is, like I looked at the, what's the one? Simon Hanselman.
Yeah.
Or is it Simone Hanselman? I'm going to say it both ways.
There you go. Cover your bases.
Covering my bases. But it's one of those Meg, Mog, and Owl pieces. And that's how the statement, a typical short Meg, Mog, and Owl piece. And I don't know if you've read any of these books before. I mean, this is like an ongoing series that Fantagraphics puts out, and I think Vice put out some of the like more the shorter episodes. But it's like a witch, her familiar who's a cat, and their roommate who's an owl. They all do drugs. They're all depressed, and they all do horrible things to each other. But I just like that statement. It's like a typical Meg, Mog, and Owl piece. Owl is attempting to do something nice in a normal fashion, and is thus then shat upon by his friends, in quote, friends. Alludes to Owl being slightly creepy and manipulative with young women in his dating relationships.
Mm-hmm. And it ends with an ellipsis.
Yeah.
Not a period.
Which, makes sense for them. And they look like, cartoony, but they're depicted in a painterly fashion. So it's like typical cartoons. But his books, I don't know if you've read much of his work, but I've read a few of the books, or a couple of the books, and they're very dark. Like, they seem like they're jokey, like drug humor kind of thing. And, sometimes things get sexual, but these people are profoundly depressed and drowning in sorrow. And when that comes out, it's just like, and it comes out a lot in seemingly whimsical, like you think it's going to be a jokey thing, or, but horrible things happen. There's a guy named Werewolf Jones who does horrible things with a cheese grater to his body.
it's Christmas. Happy, happy Christmas.
Hear those bells a-ringing, hear the children singing.
Ho, 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 it's Christmas. Happy, happy Christmas.
Time to get the stockings hung,
Time to trim the tree.
time to get the candles lit for all the world to see.
Ho, 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 it's Christmas. Happy,
And, I think that, you read the statement from Hanselman, and I think the difference in statements adds to the enjoyment of the book, because different creators talk either or write more or less or in particular voices or with certain twists of humor in ways that vary greatly.
Right.
Like, for instance, I think it's the next piece or no, two pieces later, Jaime Hernandez's statement with Forest Spirits. Tanta and her friends are close to graduating high school. Her older sister, Vivian, has infiltrated their private world. Very short 2-sentence statement.
Yeah.
Nothing really much about the larger context of, who is Tanta?
Right.
She is relatively speaking, a newer addition to Jaime's Love and Rockets world or universe. Why is she important? What is the significance of Vivian? There's no reference to her being called Frogmouth. But anyway, that's fine. It's short and sweet. That's what Jaime wanted to do. Other creators are a little more involved in their statements in terms of setting a context or some background or what have you. And I like that. It's just that my earlier statement that there should be more consistency with the biography, I do think that, if different creators are going to write different statements and they're going to write different biographies. But I think the biography should be a little more consistent and involved. So, for instance, Jaime's biography is also just 3 sentences long, but it's almost the same length in terms of word count as his statement. So there's not much there. Now, people who pick up every year's Best American Comics probably already know who Jaime is. Yeah. Still, it'd be nice to have a little more biographical information about him and maybe highlight like 2 or 3 of his standout titles, like the Tie Girls, right? Work from several years ago, let's say. To have the biographical information more consistent and thorough throughout the entire volume. But again, I think that's an extremely minor point.
Yeah, and I love, Jaime said, this is something I never paid attention to, but at the end of his biographical statement, I hope to one day draw a correct ear.
Yeah.
The fact that there's almost no ears in his comic, like everyone's hair covers their ears, which to me is funny. But I also think that for Chloë Perkis's work too, I think the point of that is also the biography is slightly off, I think, because Chloe's trying to represent herself in a way that is, different, I think, and not quite the norm. And so that one might be purposefully, not obtuse, but something so that it doesn't read quite the same as the others because, this playing around with, gender binaries and things like that.
Yeah. But again, I think, theirs is short and sweet like Jaime's is. And so it's really no different from most of the others. And it doesn't really tell us, at least the way I read it, much about their personality and what they're trying to get across. But you're right. It's just 2 sentences long and a website. So, and that may be enough. But again, why not have something more consistent across the board in terms of the biography? But again, I think I've talked enough about that. I do appreciate the statements more than the biographies because that does give us a little bit more of a window into the personalities of the creators. Yeah,
I agree. I like the statements myself just to you kind of get, their take on a thing or what they think it does or, setting it all up, I think is it's helpful. It's helpful, especially since some of these things are excerpts, especially since some of these things are short and you don't know what what context they're in. Some of them are in webcomics, some of them are in published volumes, some of them are just kind of out by themselves.
Yeah. And who knows, maybe there are creators who didn't even, or maybe even want to write their own biography and even statement. And I'm looking at, as a potential example, I have no way of knowing if this is the case or not, but Ted Stern's excerpt from The Moolah Tree. And I like The Moolah Tree. That's one of those works that I was already familiar with. But the statement is in the third person. So either Stern is writing about himself in the third person, or he didn't write the statement. And so maybe Phoebe Gloeckner or someone else wrote the statement for him.
Yeah, and I really appreciate the one before it by Ariel Schrag. She did a comic about things I regret, and it was published in the Columbia College Today online. So it's like a university comic, really. But it's a short comic about regret, and her statement was, "I've been wanting to write this comic for a long time, and finally just had to do it before too many more regrets piled up." It's like short and sweet, and I like her. She's another one of those. I'm very familiar with her past work, and I don't necessarily keep up with her, but I'm glad to see her in here. I mean, I don't know. I thought it was a clever comic about things she regrets, which looks sort of like that. But if you look at it, I don't know how this is going to translate to the audio version. You guys are missing out. You need to come hang out with us and see the pictures.
Yeah, we've got several viewers who are in the room right now looking at us. So that's cool. And a couple have commented in the chat. I want to say a little while ago, I said that there were probably just 2 creators and pieces that I wasn't aware of before that I really appreciated. Actually, I mean, there's a third, and this is another excerpt. This is by Lale Westvind, and this is an excerpt from Yazar and Arcadis. And let me give you a sample of the art. If you can see, I know I have my light that may get in the way. And yeah, there's something about this excerpt that I really appreciated as well. But this is one of those other comics that there are parts of it that probably the people at Yahoo wouldn't want me to display for the camera.
I've heard they're very nitpicky.
Yeah.
I'm just saying.
Yeah. So, and we're trying to keep this PG, let's say.
That's right. 13 maybe.
Yeah. Okay.
Throw in a swear over here and there.
What other entries in this year's volume, really stood out to you?
I liked that one you just talked about too, that Yazur and Arcadis. I really enjoyed that one. The backgrounds are pink, which made it kind of unusual for me to look at. I mean, I liked Aaron Lang's art school. It made me think a lot about, and I think it brought up. Did he bring it up in here? Kind of like the.
You mean Thurber?
No. There's on page 242. There's another book called. The selections are called Art School, but they're from a comic called Trim Number 5.
Okay, I see.
Comics Company by Aaron Lang.
Oh yeah, these the short pieces.
Yes.
Yeah. I really enjoyed Lang's art. I've seen it before. Yeah. And
I hadn't, but it kind of looks a little bit Robert Williams-y to me. The guy who did he's underground comic, Robert Williams. Like in that, I'm not saying it's derivative or anything like that, but it kind of reminded me the lettering, especially that one I just showed you with, the guy's like lighting up. He's got a little, he's taking a little hit of a weed, and, he's got a little X on his forehead, and the smoke says Art School, but it looks, just that style of lettering. Mm-hmm. But, I like, anything like, these one page, I would call them almost gag strips set in art school where, one pagers. And I really enjoyed looking at those. I like the style. I had not been familiar with him before. So, that to me, and I have illusions about what art school is like. So I kind of like seeing input into that.
That's good. That reminds me of one of the entries I really enjoyed in this year's volume. And this is something quite early. This is DJ Bryant's, the excerpt is Echoes into Eternity. And I'll put it up for our viewers. Now, this is from a book that came out last year from Fantagraphics called Unreal City, which is a collection of stories. And they're not stories that are interlinked in any kind of cyclical or what in prose is called short story cycle manner. But it was one of those works that was an honorable mention in terms of last year's end of the year show. It wasn't one of the 10 that I highlighted, but it was one of the ones that I wanted to mention because both Paul, who did the show with me at that point, and I did was, we, as we'll do next week, highlight what we consider our 10 favorites, not necessarily the best. We call it our favorites. And then also there are some like honorable mentions, right? Mm-hmm. And so Bryant's Unreal City was one of those honorable mentions. But if you could see, again, the art that I'm holding up here, there's something – I remember reading Unreal City was my first exposure to DJ Bryant's work. And I looked at it and I thought, oh, my God, this just reminds me of Daniel Klaus. Mm-hmm. in some of his work. And by that, I do not mean derivative in any way. It just reminded me of the kind of style that I saw and I really appreciate when it comes to, not only Klaus, but also creators like this. It's kind of a clean style. I mean, there is something maybe a tad cartoony about it, but it's more realistic than otherwise. And I really do enjoy Bryant's aesthetic. At the same time, this is a fascinating short story, echoes into eternity, about a woman who's in a relationship. She's in a marriage, and doesn't seem to be that engaged. She is much more drawn to this mysterious figure that she sees from a distance. Then at one point, she goes to this individual's house, this young man's house, and sleeps with him. And then, I don't want to give anything away, something really strange happens that will freak you out when you read this for the first time. And it has everything to do with identity and gender. I mean, there's a really interesting flip, I would call it, that Bryant takes in this story. So that was a standout for me. But then again, I was already familiar with this. Yeah, I hadn't read that book, and I really loved that story too, because it worked on multiple levels, like you said. Like, that story was gripping and very fascinating for me, and I loved the artwork. And it was like if this is it looks Klausian. We can say Klausian, right? It looks like if Klaus and Paul Gulacy had if you average them together, it would be this style in a way, which is to me a compliment, because both of them are very polished and I love their art styles. And I'm glad you noted this one, because this is one that really jumped out at me. There's two more that really I enjoyed. And it's the following one, The Warlock Story by Max Klottfelter, which is a kind of an autobiographical story written on it looks like notebook paper, like kind of like My Favorite Thing Is Monsters, but it's a kind of an account about this, young man looking back at his life, and he was into comics, and he's not popular in school. A lot of people didn't like him. So he started drawing comics that very much pushed the envelope in a lot of ways. And, were very sexual and very violent, and, had really crazy characters like Kid Killer, Nazi Claus, a guy named Mop, a guy named Warlock, Jeffrey Dahmer was in them, and Heinrich Himmler, and Janet Reno, the usual suspects you expect in a comic book drawn by some kids in high school. And how when his parents found them, he ended up they sought counseling for him, and he ended up in trouble, and a teacher got one of his books, and kind of the aftermath of that. And, and what happens later when he comes back to the house after, being a 20-year-old out at college, and he starts looking for these things and talking to his parents about what this experience was like for them. That one really jumped out at me, just because it kind of hit a lot of areas, because he seems to be about as old as I am, I would say. He liked he listened to King Missile, and King Missile for me was a big band in high school. I don't know if you've ever listened to King Missile. No, I have not.
But you know the song Detachable Penis. You've heard Detachable Penis. Have you heard Detachable Penis?
No, I have not.
See, it's just fun to say. But it's more like spoken word with music behind it. And they were a very weird, obscure band, I guess. That was their hit, which I'm doing in air quotes. It was a hit. But that one jumped out at me as one I liked, because it was very first person, and then towards the end it kind of went the other way, and it was kind of have his vision pricked by what his parents conceived of happening at the time. I liked that one a lot.
Okay, I just saw that Eris in the chat room said a moment ago, in the video we are only watching Sterg, so if Derek showed something, it was not visible. Oh. And I'm wondering, so maybe this, and again, I'm just learning over the past couple of weeks, Google Hangouts on air. I'm wondering if I, as creator, in the main name under Comics Alternative of this, need to showcase my image when I'm talking, and then make your image prominent when you're talking. I don't know. My wife was giving me reaction from last week's recording about what it looked like, and she said that basically whoever was talking or making noise, like for instance, if I went on the mic as you were talking, the camera would briefly go to me because of the noise of me clearing my throat. But that's not what's happening, at least in my screen right now. So maybe it's the way that my settings are up. But
well, you guys are getting some weird facial expressions and me drinking tea because I have a cold and I'm trying to keep my voice fresh and mellifluous.
Yeah. And this is something that I can work on for future attempts at this.
Mr. Snowman, I'm so lucky I can run and play. How I wish you were alive. We laugh and play all day.
There's another entry that, again, wasn't one of my favorites, but I thought that it's interesting, and I was familiar with this creator before, Laura Palmall, and Laura Palmall is the pseudonym of Jason Lee, and this is, and Eris, I hope you can see this, an example of Laura Palmall's work, and I can't remember where I've seen or what I've seen of Palmall's in the past. But these are, in essence, one-pagers that in many ways are kind of political in nature, that have something to say about our contemporary society, especially as it defines Americanness in the Trump age. And then there's another, and this was Things More Likely to Kill You Than
ISIS.
And then there's another piece by Palmall under another pseudonym called Busy Comic, which is a one-pager of a guy being too busy to do anything. And, it's kind of fun. Again, not one of my favorites, but something that a creator that I was familiar with in the past and something that I, enjoyed.
Yeah, I like that one as well. That was one of the ones that, it was funny and political. What will kill you? What's more likely to kill you than ISIS? Hot dogs. Hot dogs are more,
Yeah. As we are wrapping up our discussion of Best American Comics 2018, we should say something about the notable comics that are listed in the back. And one of the things that, in not just Bill Kartalopoulos, the series editor, but the previous editors before Bill have done is at the end of each year's volume, they have included a list of other works that are not included in this particular year's volume. But if you liked what you read in this year's volume, then you should probably check out some of these other titles. In other words, these are the ones, I don't know if you want to call them the also rans or honorable mentions or what have you, but these are other notable comics that are at least as good, I think, as many of the ones that are included in the annual anthology. Some of these are familiar to me. So, for instance, Bill Griffith's Zippy the Pinhead. And when is Zippy the Pinhead not one of the best comics in a particular year, at least in my book? Sammy Harkham's Crickets #6. Jillian Tamaki's Boundless is another one. Seth's Palookaville #23. So there's a lot here to really sink your teeth into. I want to make a comment, though, about the notable comics. Now, Serge, we were discussing early on that if a reader picks up basically any volume of Best American Comics, and this reader is someone who, let's say, is more traditional and even conservative, and I don't mean that in a political sense, in terms of their comics reading. In other words, they're much more familiar and comfortable with the mainstream, or maybe that's all that they know. And again, mainstream broadly defined. Then they're going to be frustrated by this because they're going to say, hey, many of these aren't comics. Or they're going to say, this that looks like it's written by my nephew is better than, fill in the blank from the mainstream.
Spider-Man.
Exactly. Now, in terms of the entries themselves every year, I know that one of the limiting factors is getting the copyrights. Okay. So there may be an incredible kick-ass Batman story that maybe by Tom King, probably, that is one of the best, or maybe even something from Vertigo, like for instance, Sheriff of Baghdad, that was, I think, the year that it came out, one of the best. But yet there are going to be problems and maybe Sheriff of Baghdad was included in a previous volume of Best American Comics. I can't remember. But at least in terms of the DC Marvel properties, it's going to be cost prohibitive for the editors, or at least Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, to pay for the rights to reproduce even an excerpt from that. And that's unfortunate. One of the things, though, about the notable comics in the back is that it allows at least Bill Kartalopoulos as guest editor, because he says he's the one who, as he even said, selected by Bill Kartalopoulos, he's the one who lists these notable comics. It's an opportunity to include maybe more mainstream stuff along with more indie self-published and alternative material that didn't really get, through logistical reasons, maybe financial reasons, exposure in the anthology proper. This year, in most years, there are 2 or 3, usually no more than 4 from what I can recall, mentions of titles of what I would call mainstream. Here, there's nothing. Did you notice that?
I did. I was curious about whether when Bill was talking about the process, that he does pick 120 books, and then the editor culls from there and maybe has a thing or two that gets added. If this was just the list of everything Bill sent, like this is the remainder. This is what's not in the rest of the book. But yeah, I agree. And there were some things in there that I thought were, there were a couple things I thought were slam dunks that might not necessarily work excerpted. Like Eleanor Davis's "You and a Bike in a Road" was one of my favorite comics from last year.
That was a good one.
And I think on the next page on what was it called? I just looked at it. Sorry, it's I just looked at it. Oh, where did it go? I mean,
Ben Passmore's Your Black Friend.
Yeah, that's the one. That's exactly the one. Ben Passmore's Your Black Friend. I read your mind. Yeah, you did, because that to me is a very powerful book. But that book seems unacceptable to me. Unacceptable, just because it kind of works as a whole. It's not very long, but I think you got to have all of it in here, and there's got to be decisions about what you can have and what you can't have. And I agree. I mean, I think the closest thing to a mainstream is something like the Chris Ware one from like the New Yorker, which is
but definitely not mainstream. Well, I mean, it's a mainstream publication, but definitely Chris Ware is not a mainstream creator.
Yeah, but yeah, there's not a lot of Vertigo in here.
There's no Vertigo.
Right.
I don't think. And there's nothing from Image. There's nothing from Dark Horse. I mean, we have the Geof Darrow Shaolin Cowboy excerpt, but that's in the anthology proper. And I mean, I have no problem with this. It's just that, at least where I'm coming from in terms of comics, and I'm much more, I think, appreciative of the mainstream and inclusive in that way, is I would have liked to have seen some from, let's say, premier publishers, as I've called them, that are at least as good, if not better, than, at least in my view, than some of the ones that are listed here in Notable Comics. And this Notable Comics section is the place to list those. On the other hand, something that Bill said, and something I think you and I knew already about these Best American Comics volume, but he said this when we interviewed him the other day, and that was that each volume of Best American Comics says something about the editors. So, as we were talking about, this volume from 2018 says something about Phoebe Gloeckner. Sure. Last year's definitely said something about Ben Catcher. So on and so forth, right? But it also says something about the series editor. So in looking at the Notable Comics list in the back, it does tell us something about the series editor and what he may tend to privilege. And one of the things I haven't done, and I guess because my volumes of previous Best American Comics are packed away somewhere, I need to find them, is to go back and see, let's say, what Matt Madden and Jessica Abel included in Best American Comics, notables in the back, and that would say something about them. So I do take this, as Henry James said, you have to take artists in their domain. In other words, take them on their grounds. So don't read them outside of where they're coming from or what they're attempting to do. So I don't want to impose anything on Bill Kartalopoulos in terms of his choice and his aesthetics. It's just that my notable section from the same time period, September 2016 into August 2017, would probably be vastly different. But again, that, there's nothing wrong with that. There's no right or wrong. It's just tells us something about what people privilege.
Yeah, and it also might be a matter of what people send in. I mean, I remember part of the process is people submit work to Bill, and he's got the initial call to it. And I mean, I'm only saying this because I remember being not even remember. I did it last year. I was a judge in a comics narrative award given out by the Denver Comic-Con for it was excellence in graphic arts narratives. And so I got a bunch of books to read, and I had to read a whole lot of books in a month. And it was, publishers picked who to send what to. Right. So there were companies that after a while, I was like, I don't have any like first, second books. And I was like, for middle schools, first, second seems like they better be represented. And and at the time I just emailed one of the publicity people, and I was like, this is an award that's going on, and you might want to send some things. And she responded with, well, we didn't know it was out there. And, what do you suggest? What titles would you suggest I send out to people? And so, we kind of got some submissions that way. And all this to say, I don't know. I mean, right now in the current, and this is me talking out of a certain orifice that you can't see because it's below the camera. I don't think Marvel is going to send anything voluntarily to Best American Comics. Personally, I don't think their corporate radar cares about their comics to the degree. And I don't know about DC, although I tend to be thinking with them having entities like Vertigo that maybe they would. Image is the same, and I don't know. And I don't know if it's one of those things where, Bill's got a certain proclivity towards, whatever. I mean, all of us have subjectivities when we go through this. Right. And maybe some of the publishers figure out, he hasn't put one of our books in before, and we sent the best of what we think is the best. And I always had a weird feeling about what people thought were the best. Like when I'm not trying to downplay with publishers, but there were some books I got and I was like, really? You sent this book? Like, I know your output. And I was thinking this is a great book for middle school, but you sent this book instead, which didn't make sense to me. Yeah. And that's, trying to read people's minds or figure out what they're kind of looking for. I think there might be some cross purposes sometimes too. Like publishers sometimes want to be like, I'm going to push a book rather than I'm going to put out the best book. Like this is the one we think will sell. So we're going to send you that one instead of the one that is probably the best, and it's like you talked about, our favorites are not necessarily the best. There might be technically gorgeous comics that leave us cold. Excuse me. I talk too much. I need tea.
Take a swig, my friend. Oh, you okay?
I know. I just started coughing.
Oh, geez. Well, okay. So as you're regaining your composure, so to speak, yeah, you're right in that much of this is probably dependent on what publishers send in. At the same time, and as Bill pointed out when we talked to him the other day, that many of these comics are also the result of both him and his annual guest editor going out and finding things. And Bill was telling us that he would go into comic shops, he would go to cons. And so it's not just what publishers send in, but again, this comes back to subjectivity and taste. And it tells us, at least this notable comics list, something about what Bill reads and what he privileges in terms of comics. And someone else who may be the series editor would be looking at this and have in a different way and have a completely different list. So again, there's no right or wrong to this, but that it does say something about the aesthetics and sensibilities of a particular editor. And if I think readers keep that in mind instead of looking at this word best,
right,
in kind of a more objective way, then I think that they can appreciate more these annual volumes of Best American Comics. I've said it several times on the show before, on past episodes where we look at the Best American Comics. I still think that it's rather unfortunate that it has that title, and I know why it does, because it's part of Houghton Mifflin Harcourt's series of various genres like the short story, the essay, and whatnot. Best American Essays, Best American Short Stories. Okay, I get that. It's just it maybe a tad misleading. Now, if you call it the Best American non-mainstream comics, that I think would be more in line with what we see here. This brings me back to something that I did mention in our interview with Bill Kartalopoulos, and that is his foreword. I always appreciate his forewords in every volume, and he tends to use the forewords in a way, not just to introduce readers to what Best American Comics as a series is all about, but it seems like every year he focuses on some aspect, some message that he wants to highlight. And in this year's foreword, he is talking about the responsibilities of a critic of comics, and this reader critic having an open mind, going beyond certain, let's say, tastes and subjective predispositions. And I think I even used the word preemptive strike because I'd asked him in the interview, if you recall, if maybe he was writing this in certain ways almost as a reaction to some reactions he may have gotten from some readers in terms of Best American Comics. And I think he said, no, he didn't have that in mind. But I do think that what he writes in the foreword in some ways kind of addresses what at least some readers of this may think of as this is the best, or why not include such and such? Everybody's going to have their own list of best subs and whatnot. Everybody's going to Monday Morning or Armchair Quarterback.
Right.
However, I think what he says in his foreword in this year's volume kind of addresses that to some point. But again, keep this in mind as you read not just the entries in this year's volumes, but also the list at the very back of notable comics from the year.
And that's, I don't know. I think we could. Armchair. I'm thinking armchair comics critic. It's like, that's almost the definition of my job right now.
Yeah.
But I don't know. To me, I think it is, we were talking a little bit about this, and when it comes to the best series, really the only one I read was the best non-required reading one that Dave Eggers edited. And, maybe going in that kind of thing too, because I think when you talk about best, it does kind of have that sense of like, this is representative. So if I read no other comics in a year, I could pick up this book and get, the creme de la creme of the comics that are published in America. And, by my count, I think there was one Canadian one and one from Mexico, which, North American. And I don't envy him trying to represent everything, too. But I wonder about, that name. I get too. It's a marketing thing. It's the best one. So you expect it to be the best one, but it's just, it's definitively subjective. So no matter what happens, it's going to be, I think it makes this talk fun actually, because it's what makes us be able to debate, to kind of push back at it, to talk about the volume, to talk about maybe things that are in there that maybe we think are like, oh, well, this, our response to it anyway, about what we think and how it works. I mean, I do think it runs the gamut, and I appreciate that about it. Is that, is it the best? I don't know. It's like, I'm not saying Bill does this, but is he like, I'm going to do the best kind of biographical comic. I'm going to do the best comment on, like the best 3 mini comics or something like that. I don't know, like if they have slots, like they're thinking about like, let's have ones that, are nonfiction. Let's have ones that are fiction. Let's have ones that are short stories. Let's have ones, excerpt from a book that we think, or the 4 or 5 books. I don't know that, like if they have it, like approach it almost like slots that they have to cover.
Yeah. I don't get that sense. And also keep in mind that, as Bill pointed out to us, not just in the interview you and I did with him a few days ago, but also he said this on previous interviews, that, it's the guest editor of that particular year that has the final say. I guess along with the approval of Houghton Mifflin Harcourt,
right?
What goes in. But, even if, I do think that with certain comics readers, let's say what some people call the Wednesday Warriors, right, who are much more familiar and comfortable with the mainstream, I do think that something like this is necessary. I can't highly recommend enough every year's Best American Comics volume, because I think that not only do they showcase fascinating works, but as we mentioned earlier and you and I discussed, it introduces us to things that we weren't familiar with before, and it challenges us when it comes to our definition of what comics are.
Yeah, and I appreciate it too. I mean, to me it was it has a lot, and the people that I know people that I don't know, comics that I can't possibly have found on my own. So I appreciate that, finding those kinds of, nuggets that I would not have access to otherwise.
That's right. Well, there you have it. Our look at the 2018 volume of the Best American Comics. This year, guest edited by Phoebe Gloeckner, and the series editor is Bill Kartalopoulos. And this came out back in very early October from Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. And I can't wait to hear who the 2019 guest editor is going to be.
And we'll find out fairly early in 2019 from what Bill said.
Yeah. And this is great. Now, if you like great comics like what is found in the Best American Comics, then you would do well to go to the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. Remember, go to dcbservice.com, and there, every single month, you're going to find mind-blowing specials. I mean, literally, your mind will blow. There'll be a hole in the back of your head because you can't contain the amazement of the discounts that you'll get from Discount Comic Book Service.
Wear a hat just to help things. Help clean up, if nothing else.
That's right. So, in all seriousness, go to dcbservice.com. I know that I shop there. Sturge, I think you shop there as well.
I do.
So they're not just our sponsor, but they are also, at least for me, my local comic shop in many ways.
That's right. I'm not just what was that? There used to be a commercial. I'm not just this. I'm also a client.
Oh, I think that's Hair Club for Men.
That's right.
Okay, I think that's the first time that Hair Club for Men has been referenced on an episode of the Comics Alternative. And with that in mind, if you want to complain about these vague pop cultural references, then definitely get in touch with us and let us know what you think about our lame comments and more specifically what you thought about my and Sturge's discussion of this year's volume of Best American Comics. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up your phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
That's right. Or you can email us the new old-fashioned way at 2guys@comicsalternative.com. Or if you feel inclined to critique my jokes and pop cultural references, I'm Sturge at comicsalternative.com.
And I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. You can also find us all over social media and contact us that way. We have accounts on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, Slack, and Discord. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on Spotify, on TuneIn, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Podcasts. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com.
We're everywhere. Bow to us.
I don't know if we need that fealty, but but at least listen to us.
Come click on us.
Yes. And we do appreciate feedback. So definitely get in touch. And we thank everyone who came by to witness the live streaming of this episode. We won't do this for the next, I guess, several episodes, maybe. I don't know when we'll do this again, but we'll let you know via email and also via social media that we'll be doing another live streaming event. But remember, Sturge and I will be back next week when we highlight what each of us consider our favorites of 2018.
That's right. I was going to say the best comics alternative of 2018.
That's right. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Sturge.
Take care.
Peace.
Have a happy ho ho ho. It's a jolly way to say hello. Have a happy ho ho ho. May Santa be good to you. Make your troubles go go go. It's not really very hard, you know. Just sing a happy ho ho ho. That's all you have to do. Share the Christmas spirit and you can't go wrong. Someone said may hear it and be happy all year long. So have a happy ho ho ho. Sing this song to everyone you know. Have a happy ho 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 and you'll be happy too. There are many ways of saying Merry Christmas, and I used to think that a brand new way. I heard it just today. I hope you like it too, because it's really lots of fun. It's have a happy ho ho ho. It's a jolly way to say hello. Have a happy ho ho ho. May Santa be good to you. Make your troubles go go go. It's not really very hard, you know. Just sing a happy ho ho ho. That's all you have to do. Share the Christmas spirit and you can't go wrong. Someone said may hear it and be happy all year long. So have a happy ho ho ho. Sing this song to everyone you know. Have a happy ho 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 and you'll be happy too. And you'll be happy too. Have a happy ho ho ho.
Hey, what happened?